Hello everybody, welcome back to this channel. In this video, what I'm going to be covering is Vue testing. So we're going to learn how we can test out our Vue application, whether it's a component, whether it's multiple components interacting together, and really just our whole Vue application as a whole. So we're going to learn how to test it. We're going to learn the good practices of testing our Vue application. And to do this, of course, what we're going to need to utilize is some sort of testing library. And the most popular Vue testing library, and actually the official unit testing library of Vue, is Vue Test Utils. And this is really popular, and for a good reason. It's really easy to use. It's very effective. It's very intuitive. I think you guys, once you use it, you guys are going to fall in love with it. And so that's what we're going to be utilizing to test out our Vue applications. Now, I just want to note that under the hood, this is using another testing library called Jest. This is by far one of the most popular JavaScript testing libraries. It was developed by Facebook, and it is also very easy to use and very effective. I actually do have a crash course just purely on Jest if you want to take it. But a lot of the testing libraries, like React testing library, is using Jest under the hood. So you don't need to know Jest for this, but you will know Jest after taking this crash course because, well, it's using it under the hood. So that's what we're going to be doing, and hopefully you guys find this very informative. Now to do this, let's actually just set up our Vue application and let's install Vue Test Utils within it. So to do this, what we're going to need to do is go inside of our terminal. Now move into whatever directory that you want. I'm just going to move into my desktop directory. And in here, the first thing that we need to do is create a Vue application. Now to do this, I like to use the Vue CLI. So to use the Vue CLI, what we're going to do is just say Vue create, and then we're going to create our application. I'm going to call this testing tut. Now, if you don't have Vue installed, and I do expect you to have Vue knowledge if you're taking this crash course, being that this is a Vue testing, I'm not going to be explaining Vue to you. I'm going to explain how to test things to you. But you may not have the Vue CLI installed. So to install the Vue CLI, you have to just do this command right over here. So just do sudo, then this is going to be really dependent if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine. So if you're on a Mac or Linux, you're probably going to have to do sudo. And then if you're on a Windows, you can probably get away with it. And then over here, you could just do npm install, and then with the -g flag, meaning that it's global, and then @vue_CLI. So go ahead and do this. Go ahead and install this, because we're not only going to create our Vue application using the CLI, we're also going to add the testing framework using that CLI. So again, the command to create a Vue application is Vue create testing tut. So let's go ahead and let's create this, and it's going to, oh, it shouldn't really give you this. Let's just do, I already created this just to speed things up. So I'm just gonna add an extra T just so you guys see what, just so you guys can see here. You should get this drop down over here, and then you're asked, hey, do you want to use Vue 2, Vue 3, or manually select a feature? Select Vue 3, and what this should do is go ahead and start installing things. You can see I already have a package here. I'm going to go ahead and delete it because this command does take quite a while to run. I already installed it, but once this command's done, you should have a Vue application up and running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into that Vue application, and I'm going to do code dot. And what this is going to allow me to do is open up this directory inside of VS Code. I set it up so that it does that. It might not do it for you if you're utilizing VS Code. Maybe you can do a quick search on the internet to see how you can do it. But if you're not even using VS Code, then just open it up in whatever text editor that you're using, or you can just open up VS Code and just manually move into this directory. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to open this up. And you can see here that I get a very simple, like boilerplate Vue application. So you can see here we have the source directory, we have a logo, probably the Vue logo. We have a component here, hello world, just a lot of stuff going on here. And over here we have our app file. So we have our app file. And right now I'm actually running it, so let me just quickly close it. And to run it, let's just go to our package.json. And over here, we can see here, to run our application, we have to run serve. So we're gonna do inside of our integrated terminal, or if you're using some other editor, just go back to this terminal here. Let's do npm run serve. So we're gonna do an npm run serve. Sorry, I just had to reset my terminal because I already ran this before. And now you can see that our application is up and running on localhost 880. So now what we can do is we can just go to localhost 880 and we have this very boilerplate application over here. So we're saying welcome to your Vue app, which is, well, terrific. We are finally welcome to our Vue app. So now what we want to do is, well, we want to test our application. And if we look at all of our dependencies, you can see here that there's nothing really related to Jest or that Vue Testing Utils library. So the reason for this is because we have to add it. So let's open up another terminal, and to add this, and really the best way of adding this is to use the CLI, because it sets up a lot of things and it actually gives us a mock test that we can look at. So over here, we're going to do view and then add, and then what we're going to say is unit jest. So we're going to say unit jest. And this is going to add that library in for us. So you can see here, it's adding a bunch of things for us. And this is actually the recommended way of adding it. So let's just wait a little bit. And if this takes a while, I'll probably just pause the video, and I will not. Maybe it's getting closer. I was just about to pause it, but it is getting, there we go. It seems like it's there. Maybe I'll have to pause it. I really don't want to. All right, let us wait. And there we go. Awesome. Okay, cool. And I guess it's doing some more downloads. But in the meanwhile, you can see here that we get Vue Test, which is something that we get. What we also really get is this really, really cool test file over here. And in here we have our unit test, and it gives us this example test. And this is kind of the structure that we're going to follow throughout our crash course. And let's actually go back to the package.json. Let's actually copy this over here so I can try to find it in the package.json. You can see here that we have added this test utils library. And you can see here it's getting from @Vue, which means it's really the official testing library of Vue. So let's go over here to the spec file, and we're not going to dissect it now. We're going to dissect it in the next section. But if you look at this test file, each test is going to be very, very, very similar to this over here. Extremely similar to what's going on here. Maybe some tests are going to be a little bit more complicated, but the premise of what's going on here, and I'll explain in great detail what is going on here in the next section, is what we are going to be doing for every single test. We also get this really cool jest.config, and this is where we can actually configure Jest. Because remember, we're using Jest under the hood, and sometimes we want to configure it in different ways, and we can actually do that inside of this file over here. Now, the last thing that I want to note is let's go back to the package.json, is now we have inside of the scripts directory, we have this brand new test script over here. So test :unit. And what this is going to do is run our tests. Now, actually, what we have is one test right over here. So we have this one test over here. So let's actually go ahead inside of our terminal and let's run npm run test and then :unit. And what this is going to do is it's going to look for all of the test files inside of this directory. And the test files have to follow this very specific format. Example, which is the name of our test. This can be anything, but then .spec and then .js. So let's go here and let's run this. And you can see in a quick second, it found this test file over here. And over here, this is the name of the test. Again, we'll talk about this later. But over here, each test has a name. And then over here, it's running the test, and the test has passed. And so that is how we're going to be running our tests. Now, in a production application, of course, we're going to want to run it over here as well, but we're also going to want to run it in CI. And I just said this just for your information. This is not something I will be doing and teaching you inside of this crash course. Maybe in a future crash course, I'll show you how to set up some sort of CI with GitHub Actions or Circle CI. All right, well, that's awesome. We have our application set up. Now let's start talking about the structure of this test file. Now that we have set up our application, let's start looking at the test structure that we saw in that one test file. So what I went ahead and did is I just copied and pasted that test inside of my presentation, and we're going to go through every single line of code right now just so we can understand it, because again, like I said, the structure that is going on here is going to be very, very similar to the structure that will be going on in most of your other tests. So for now, let's just focus on this block right over here. So from here to here. So from here to here. Now this right here, this it statement is representing a test block. And what this is just a block that is going to test something within our component. Now, what is it testing? Well, we're going to describe exactly what we're testing inside of this test block as inside of the first parameter over here, which is a string. And over here, this is just going to be a description of what we're testing. So here we're saying renders props.message when it's passed. So when we pass some sort of message prop, it should render that message. So that's what we are testing. Now we're going to have to write the logic for our test. Where is that going to live? Well, inside of the second parameter, we're going to add a callback, and inside of that callback, that is where the logic is going to live. So that right there is the test block. We're going to represent a test block with it, and then we're going to have a message saying, hey, what are we testing here? And then we're going to have the callback that's going to have the logic for our test. Now, we can have multiple test blocks in a file, and that's extremely common. It happens 99% of the time. So we can have multiple it statements that test multiple things within our component. All right, so now let's actually move in within the test block. So right here we have const message is equal to new message. Well, this makes sense. We just have a variable here. But here is where it gets a little bit interesting. Here, we're telling our test exactly what component we want to test. So we want to test this hello world component. And we get this hello world component from our actual Vue file. So our add components and then hello world.vue. And this is the component that we want to test. Now, in order to test it, we need to mount it. So we need to somehow render and mount it. And to do this, we're going to use this function right over here. We can either use shallow mount or just mount, and I'll talk about the difference a little bit later. Here they're using shallow mount, and what they're doing is they're calling shallow mount and they're passing the component. And what that does is it creates a wrapper. And I don't want to confuse you guys. You can just think of a wrapper as an object that contains multiple different methods and properties that is going to be related to that specific component. And we'll actually look at one a little bit later. But really, we're just mounting it and we're returning a wrapper, which is an object that contains a lot of properties and methods, that contains a lot of information about the component that we mounted. Now, as the second parameter, we also passed in the props. So over here we have an object, and over here we have passed in the props, and then which is the message. As you can see here, we have the message here. So we passed in the props for this component. Again, we went ahead and we also mounted it and wrapped it over here. And so once we're done this, now what we want to do is, well, we want to test the component. We want to test if it works properly. In this case, we want to make sure that, hey, this message, new message, actually appears in this component when I pass it as a prop. Well, that is the job of the assertion. So this is the job of the assertion. So here, what's happening is we're saying expect, and then we're expecting the wrapper. Remember, the wrapper is an object that contains properties and methods related to that component. One of the methods is .text. And so this is going to get all of the text inside of that component. Don't worry, we'll look at all of the different methods a little bit later. Over here we have wrapper.text, and then over here we have to match, and then, well, to match message, which basically means here that the text, all of the text within this component, it has to at least match new message. So meaning new message should be in there somewhere is what we're saying. And this right here is an assertion. So we're expecting that the text inside of this component to match this. And this is either going to return true or false. If it returns false, then it's going to go ahead and fail. If it returns true, then it's going to pass. So that right there is really it. That is pretty much it. It's not that difficult. Now let's just quickly talk about this describe over here. So this is the tests, so plural block. So this is where we can group multiple tests together. In a test file, it is not uncommon to have hundreds of tests within it. And sometimes what we want to do is to group these tests together in a certain category. So right now we have just one test, so it kind of makes no sense. But imagine if we had 10 tests, 5 of which were testing a specific feature of the component, and then another 5 were testing the same component, but kind of a completely separate feature. Well, it might be good to actually group these tests somehow, some way. Well, we can do that through a describe block. And the way that it works is very similar to the test block. We have the string, which is the message. In this case, a describe block is just saying, hey, we're testing the hello world.view, but we can have something more descriptive in here, of course. And then we have this callback, and then inside of the callback, we have our tests. So we can have multiple tests within here. And sometimes it's really, really important to put things in a describe block or a tests block for scoping, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But now that you guys understand the premise of the tests file and how this looks like, let's actually go ahead and start coding out some tests. All right, time to get right into it and write our very first test. Now, for this very first test, we're gonna write a test that is extremely similar to the one that we just wrote, except it's gonna be for a brand new component that we have just created. So let's go over here into our components directory. And what I wanna do is I want to create this message.view component. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go ahead and open up the hello world.view component, and I'm just going to copy everything within here. And you know what? Let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. And so let's just paste that in there. And this is inside of the message.view component. And let's just get rid of all this rubbish. So let's go here. Let's get rid of all this junk. Let's leave the message over here. We can even get rid of this class, not really needed. We can change this to message. And then let's get rid of the styles. So this is really very, very boilerplate. Now let's do a very similar test where we are testing that if we pass it the prop of message, then it should render that particular message. So to do this, let's go inside of here. And inside of units, what I like to do is call this message, which is the name of the component, .spec.js. So right now we have our test file up and open. Now, what do we need inside of our test file? Well, we're gonna need some things, of course, to test our component. Particularly, we're gonna need to mount our component. So what do we utilize to get that mount method? Well, we're gonna utilize the @Vue Test Utils. And in the example, it was shallow mount, but for now I'm gonna use mount, and I'll explain the difference a little bit later, but for now you can kind of think of them as the same thing. They're doing the same thing. They're mounting our component and creating a wrapper. All right, so that's the first thing, but now, well, we wanna mount what component? Well, the message component, so we need to import that message component. And hopefully that's big enough for you guys. Let's just zoom in here a little bit. So we're gonna mount the message component from, well, @components, and then message.view. All right, awesome. So now let us, create the structure of our test. So with every test file, we should probably have a describe block, and we shouldn't have to import this describe block from anywhere because this is actually auto imported from Jest. And the first thing we're gonna say is we're gonna say message.view because this is what we are testing. And in here, we're gonna have our callback. And then in here, we're gonna have our test. So we're gonna say it, and then we're gonna say something very similar. Renders the props.message when passed. So the message is exactly the same, and actually the test is gonna be pretty much exactly the same. And so right now what we want to do is we want to, get the wrapper. So that's the first thing that we want to do. So let's say here const wrapper is equal to, and to get the wrapper we have to mount the component, and then we also want to pass it some props. So let's say props, and this time we're not gonna make it a variable, we're just gonna say props, and we're gonna say hello friends. So that is what we're gonna say. And now what we want to do is, okay, we have mounted it, we have gotten this wrapper. Ultimately now what we want to do is, we want to assert something. So let's say here expect, and what we want to do is we expect the wrapper dot, and you can see here, look at all the different properties and methods that we have. We have a lot of things. You have find all components, find component, unmount, exists. We have a bunch of things, but in this case, what we want to do is we want to get this text over here. And what this does is it gets all of the text inside of our component, and this is a method, so we have to call it. And so it's going to return all of the text inside of our component. Now what we can do here is then append a dot, and then over here we have a bunch of matchers. So these are a bunch of Jest matchers. They're not specific to Vue, and we utilize these matchers in order to actually test our component. Now, in the last example, we used toMatch, but in this case, we can also use something like toContain. And you can read about all of these different matchers inside of the Jest documentation. I'll have that linked in the description below. And I'm over here, I'm gonna say, I expect it to say hello friends. And so let's go ahead and save this. And now how do we execute this? We need to open up our terminal. And then in here, we're gonna run npm run, and then actually I forgot the command. Let's go over here to package.json. And we're gonna say test:unit. So test:unit. We're gonna go ahead and execute this. And you can see here that this is going to be testing our unit files, which is right over here. And you can see here that it has passed. So we see here that it has actually tested this, and you can see here that it tested it, and we have 2 tests passing at the moment. Now let's go ahead and let's say for some odd reason, let's actually close this to make it a little bit bigger. For some odd reason, we're manipulating this file, we're doing something here, and for some odd reason, we remove this part right here. So we remove the actual H1. And this is not something that we intended to do. This was just by accident. This is where tests come in to save the day. So now we want to say we're done with the code, we're happy with it, or at least we think we're happy with it. And we want to push it to, we want to merge it to master, we want to deploy it. Before we do that, we should probably run our tests just to make sure that everything works as expected. So you run your tests, and usually you do run it manually and also in CI. And then you can see here that, oh my goodness, one test failed. What test is this? You see right here, this is the test that failed, message.view. And you can see here that it's expecting this, but really it's just getting this. And then you can kind of dissect it some more, and then you can say, oh, okay, you can either say, oh, this is a problem, or you can say, oh, this is like an intended change, but I forgot to update or remove the test. So this is where tests come into place and really, really help you. So now we can go ahead and put this back. Let's say we do want it. This was unintended. We can go ahead and run this test. Sweet. Everything passed, and that's terrific. Now this is a very, very simple component. In the next sections, let's go ahead and start testing some more complex ones. Great, we have written our very first test, but now let's actually start working with more complex components. And so for the next few sections, we're gonna build a to-do component, and we're gonna go ahead and test every single aspect of that to-do component. And consequently, we're gonna actually have multiple tests inside of our test file that pertain to that specific component. So we're going to build this component from scratch, and I'm actually just going to be following the Vue Test Utils documentation. They have a quick crash course on this. I'm going to be following that just in video format, but if you ever need reference, I'll have the link in the description below. So let's just get rid of all these files over here, and in here we're going to create a brand new component from scratch. We're going to call this to-do app.vue. To make things nice and simple, let's just get everything inside of the message component and paste it in there. Now for now, we're not going to be rendering anything, so let's just get rid of the H1. In here, we're going to say that this is a to-do app. And instead of dealing with props, we're going to be dealing with state. So let's create a data method. And inside of this data method, what we want to do is return, well, some data. So let's return, and what we want to do is we want to return, and I hate how it's not auto-filling for me here, but what we want to ultimately return is a list of to-dos. So a list of to-dos over here. And the array of to-dos is going to be of objects, and each to-do is going to have an ID. So let's say our first to-do has an ID of 1. It should have also a text. So over here, we should have something, well, what is it that we wanted to do? Well, this is going to be the text. So maybe we want to learn Vue Testing. That's going to be the text. And then it's going to have a completed status. This is either going to be a false or a true value. So this is our array of to-dos. And eventually what we want to do is we want to iterate over this array and just render them inside of our Vue component. So let's just give this a save. And let me just clear my terminal really quickly. And what I actually want to do here is I want to write a test for this. And now what specifically do I want to test? Well, I want to test that it actually renders this to-do correctly. And so to test that, well, when I render this component, I should see this piece of text over here. So let's actually go ahead and write the test right now. But you might be thinking, well, this test is clearly going to fail because, well, we have the data, we have our state in here, but we're not doing anything with that state. We're not iterating over the array and rendering components, rendering elements, and thus we should not see this text over here inside of this component, and thus the test will fail. Well, that's completely fine. There's actually an approach in development called test-driven development, where you write your tests before you actually write your feature. And therefore, your tests are going to fail first, so they're going to show up as red, and then eventually you write your feature, you write the minimal amount of code to make your test pass. And that's a very, very common practice that is actually adopted by many great and reputable tech companies. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I honestly don't really have a preference for test-driven development or not test-driven development. I think we have to write tests for our components regardless, whether we do it after we create the feature or before. Sometimes it's just a preference, but in this case, I'm just going to teach test-driven development. If you find that you like to write the feature first and then test it, that's completely fine as well. All right, so let's go here. And in the units, let's create a to-do app.spec.js. All right. And so in here, we're going to create our first test. So let's just, well, import some things. We're going to import mount from @Vue Utils test. And then of course we have to import the to-do app. Now let's just go to the to-do app. Did I miss anything in here? No, I didn't. So let's go here and let's just say from, and we're gonna say at components and then to-do app.view. Very simple. All right, so now what we want to do is of course test. So let's put this in a describe block. Oh my goodness, I hate this auto import. So we're gonna say to-do app.view. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna have our test. So well, what are we testing? Well, we're testing that it should render to-do text. So it should render the to-do text. So we're gonna have our callback here. And in here, well, the first thing that we wanna do is of course get our wrapper. So let's just very easily say const wrapper. And this one's gonna be very simple. We're not gonna have to pass in any props or anything. And to-do app. Now you could say, okay, well, to finish this test off, we can just say something like expect, and we can say wrapper.text, so get all the text in the component, and we can say, you know, to contain, it should contain what we have here. So learning Vue test. This is a very common approach. We could definitely do this. However, there's just a little bit of a problem here. And let me quickly illustrate that by going through an example. So let's say that our application is humongous, very, very large. And a part of our application has this H1, this random H1, and maybe it's just like a commercial or something, some sort of ad, you know, and it says, hi, I don't know how ads are, I'm not in marketing. Hi, let's learn Vue testing. Let's learn Vue testing now. You know, let's learn Vue testing now. And then like in another part of our application, that's where we actually have our to-do. So let's say over here, this is like not the ad inside of this div. This is where we actually have our to-dos. So maybe this can be like an li tag that has all of our to-dos. So let's say let's go here, and let's say we have, I don't know, clean house, and then here pet cat, and then here let's say we also have learn Vue testing. So right now what we're doing is with this specific test over here, we're testing that inside of our whole component there is some sort of text that has learn Vue testing. So right now, okay, it's completely fine because our to-do is actually rendering. But what if we in the future we make some changes and we accidentally don't render this list at all? Something happens and we're not rendering this list. And then, you know, of course, we want to test out our application, and we run this test, and it actually is going to pass, even though the functionality that we're testing for isn't really working. And the reason for this is because we're looking at the component as a whole, and we're looking for its text, and we're seeing if it contains this piece of text over here. And actually it does. Right here we have learn Vue testing. So instead of testing the component as a whole, what a much better approach is find the specific element that we want to test inside of that component and then test it. So we want to specifically find this element over here, and just for simplicity's sake, let's just get rid of this. So we want to specifically find this element. We don't care about the other elements. We want to make sure that this li element has this text. And therefore, if this isn't present, it's going to fail because, well, it's not looking for this h1 element. It's looking for this li element. Now, what's a good way that we can find elements? Well, we can give elements specific IDs. So what we can actually do is do something like data test, and then we can say that this is equal to, let's say, to do. So this right here is equal to do. And what we can do is we can find this element by the data test ID that is equal to to-do, and that's going to find this li element. And then we can assert that the text inside of this element is learn Vue testing. So I hope that makes sense. I really do. I tried to make that as clear as possible. So let's just go ahead and save this, and we'll do this. So instead of doing this, what we're going to do is first we want to get that specific element. And let's say we give it a data test of to do. Well, to do that, what we're going to say is const to do is equal to wrapper, and we're going to use the get method. And this is a very popular method to get HTML elements inside of our Vue component. And what we can do is we can say here, quotes, and then we can wrap it in an array. And we can say data test is equal to the string to do. And now what we can do is instead of asserting that the wrapper.text to contain this, we can actually assert that the element that is the to do dot text, and we can assert it to be, because we want it to be strictly learn Vue testing. Hope that made sense. So now if I were to execute this, let's execute this by running npm run test. It's going to fail. So it's because we haven't actually rendered the element, but you guys get the point. I honestly don't really know what I was going for with executing. There we go. It fails. And so now what we can do is go ahead and actually make this functional and go ahead and actually render this component. And once we render this component, then we're going to be able to make this test pass. So let's actually go ahead and let's just, well, do that right now. So over here we have this div. And so let's say we want to just render for each to do, we want to render a div element. So here we can say div, and we can say div here, so a div. And to iterate over an array, of course, we're going to use a v4 for this. And so we're going to say to do in to do's, and then we're going to supply it with a key, of course, because we're iterating over it. So we can supply that with the to do.id. And then let's give it a data test is equal to do. And now for each element that we're iterating over, what we're going to do is we're going to supply it with a to do.text. So let's actually just visualize this, because right now we're not even running it. I mean, we are running it, and you guys just saw my LinkedIn page. So let's just go ahead and visualize this a little bit. Let's just go here real quick, and let's go to the view over here. Let's get rid of that. And so now let's just go to our to-do app. Let's go to our to-do app here. And where is it? Not the to-do app. Let's go to the app.view. And what I want to do is I want to render the to-do app. So let's go here. And let's render this to-do app. So any instance where we see hello world, let's just render to-do app. Right here. Let's get rid of that. And we'll leave the component. So I think that's good. So let's just save that. And if I were to refresh, you can see that this is really cool. It's rendering. Learn Vue testing. So you can see that it works. Now what we can do actually is go ahead and just run this again, and it should pass. So let's wait here, and it does pass. And so congrats, you have, well, written a relatively, well, not really complicated, but a kind of a meaningful test. So congrats. In the next part of our application, we need to, well, handle adding new to-dos. And so we need to add tests for this functionality. And this functionality is actually a little bit more complicated than what we have been doing thus far. Because right now, all we have been doing is just getting elements and asserting that they have a specific value. But now we need to actually interact with our component. We need to be able to input some text, which is going to be the to-do, And then we need to submit this to do, and this should render a new to do inside of our component. And we need to be able to test for all of that. So as usual, let's actually go ahead and write our test first, and then we're going to write the feature that is going to be, well, adding a to do. And so let's go here, and we're going to say that this is going to be another test, and this is another test inside of our describe block. And here we're going to say it should add new to do. So over here, and we're going to have our callback. And so what are we going to do here? Well, of course, what we're going to do is, of course, mount our component first. So let's just copy this and paste it in here. We need to mount our component in every single test block in order to get this wrapper. If this step seems a little bit tedious to you, do not worry. There's a way we can kind of alleviate all this repetitive code within our tests. But one thing I do want to note is tests do tend to be very, very repetitive. So I know we always talk about trying to keep your code as dry as possible. And that also does apply to test files as well. But test files, they're kind of a little bit an exception to the rule because they do seem very, very repetitive. But even still, we should try to make it as dry as possible if we can. Nonetheless, we'll talk about that later. All right, so what we want to do first is let's actually just do a quick assertion. We want to assert that we have one to do, at least one to do rendered. And we do have one to do. Let me just zoom in here. We do have this one to do rendered over here. So we want to assert in the very beginning we have one to do, and then later on, let's just assert that we have two to dos after we actually add our to do. So let's over here, we're going to say an expect. And then in here, we're going to say wrapper. So wrapper, and instead of wrapper.get, we're going to use wrapper.findAll. And what this is going to do is going to return all of the elements inside of an array that match the condition that we specified. So we're going to say we're going to find all of the elements that have a data test equal to do. Because remember, each time we render it, we are giving it this data test equal to do. So this is going to give us an array. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we want this to have a length of 1. So let's actually just test this out. And this test should pass right now. This assertion should pass because, well, we do have this right here. Let's give it a quick go. We should have 4 tests passing, and we do. All right, awesome. So that's the very first thing. So now what we want to do is we want to change the value of a specific input. I know we don't have an input in here at the moment, but later on we're going to want to have an input. Change the value of that input by typing into it. In the test, we're going to change it. And then we're going to want to submit the form. So over here, let's just do a wrapper .get. And we're going to say data test is equal to, we're going to call this is the input, new to do. And we want to change the value of that input simulating somebody actually typing. So what we can say here, there's a very handy method called set value. And we can say set value, and we can say new to do. Whatever this new to do is, doesn't matter. And then after we type into that input, we want to go ahead and submit the form. So over here, we can say we want to get the form at this point. I hate this stuff here. Let's actually make this a little bit bigger for you guys. So what we want to do is we want to data test, and let's just say that this is the form. And in here, what we want to do is we want to trigger a submit. So what we can actually do is very simply trigger. And then in here, you can see there's so many things we can trigger. So many different things we can trigger. So these are like multiple events. You know, the most common events that you're probably going to use is something like click over here. So click, but also you can have like click control right. So many different things you can trigger. In our case, we just want to trigger a very simple submit. All right, so here we're changing the value, then we're submitting. And then what we should assert is that we have another value in here. So we should have 2 of these. So over here, 2. All right, so let's save that and let's give this a go. And of course it is gonna fail. It is gonna fail because, well, our functionality, our to-do app, it doesn't support this. So, well, let's fix that issue right now. So let's just make it functional. So down here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a form. So down here, we're gonna add a form element. Form elements over here. And then in here, we're gonna have an input. So a input element. We're gonna give this a data test that is equal to new to do. A data test equal to new to do. We're also going to have the new to do inside of our state. So this is the new to do text. So we're gonna have that inside of our state. So the new to do text, let's just save this. And then we're gonna wanna have two-way binding. So to have two-way binding in Vue, we use the Vue model. And in here, we're gonna say new to do. So new to do. All right, so that's pretty much all we need for our input. But now in our form, we want to do some things. So let's first give it a data test, a form. And then we're also going to give it an at.prevent. And this is an at_submit.prevent. So this is so we can prevent the default behavior, which is refreshing. And then we're going to say, hey, we want you to create a to-do. And so this is a method that we're going to have to create. So right under data, which I believe is this one. For some reason, it's not showing me anything here. Let's also create some methods. So we're going to say methods. And in here, we're going to have this create to do method. And what we're going to do is we're going to say this dot to-dos dot push. We're going to want to push our new to do. So we're going to want to push our very new to do. And so the ID, we're going to want to give this a obviously kind of either an auto increment ID or a random ID. But for our cases, this is not really good, but we're just going to say 2. The only issue with that is, well, the second one that we add, it works for that one. But for every single one that we add, hard coding 2 is not really good, but it's fine for now. We're going to say text, and the text is going to be this dot new to do. So this is the, remember, this is the state that we have bound over here in the input. So this dot new to do. And then we're going to have the completed status. And initially we're going to give that a false completed status. So let's go ahead and save this. And really, this should work. And we can actually test this out. So over here, let's just say new to do. Let's press enter, and it does work. We might eventually also want to clear this, but for now, we'll just leave it like that. Let's make it as simple as possible. So clearly this works. So you know what? Let's just go ahead and let's just run our tests. You know, what are we waiting for? Let's just run our tests. You know, if this works, that's awesome. So let's go here, and you know, we're happy, our tests are gonna pass, and they fail. What is going on? Okay, so there's actually a very good reason why this failed. And what I like about Jest is it shows you exactly what it expected and what it received. So it expected 2, but it received 1, meaning that, hey, this didn't actually end up adding anything. But it's strange, when we tested it manually, it did add something. Well, we have to understand that changing state inside of our application is actually asynchronous in Vue. But right now, we're handling it as if it is synchronous. But changing state is asynchronous. So to be able to successfully account for that in our test, we have to account that, hey, this is asynchronous, and this also is asynchronous. And in JavaScript, the way that I think most devs would deal with asynchronicity is by having an async and then a wait here. So the premise of what I'm trying to say here is changing state in Vue is asynchronous, so we have to handle it in our test. So we need async await in our test. So anytime we change the state, we have to async await it. So now if we were to run this test again, now it passes. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I do encourage you on your own, I'm not gonna do this, is maybe once we actually add a to-do, I wanna clear the input. So on your own, clear the input, or on your own, write a test that says, hey, once you add this input, the value of it is cleared, and then actually implement it. I do encourage you to do that, but just for time's sake, I'm not gonna do that. So to wrap up our application, what we need to do is to, well, complete our to-do. We need to have the ability to complete a particular to-do. And whether that is by clicking on the to-do itself or a checkbox right next to it, we need to complete it, and then we need to somehow tell our user that, well, you've completed this to-do. Now, I think the best way is to have some sort of checkbox right next to the element or the to-do. And once we click it, maybe we'll have some sort of line through the text saying that, hey, you've completed this. So let's actually write the test for this. So let's go over here, and we're gonna have to write another test. So let's just go here, and what I'm gonna do is get rid of this for now. And I'm gonna be really lazy here. I'm just gonna copy and paste this, and here should be able to complete to do. That is what I'm going to call it. And so the first thing here is we have to, of course, well, mount our component. But now what we want to do is we want to trigger some sort of event. And what is this event? Well, I want to click on a checkbox. So let's just get rid of this, and let's get rid of this for now. And over here, what I want to do is I want to get. And then what element do I want to get? Well, I want to get to do checkbox. So this is going to get me a checkbox element, and I want to set its value to true. So to true. Checkboxes are either true or false. All right, that's awesome. That's really, really good. And then ultimately what I want to do is I want to expect that for that particular to-do element, the styles has changed. And how are we going to change the styles? Well, that's up to us, but I'm thinking maybe I can add a conditional class. And if it has that class, maybe a class that is completed. If it has that class, then it's going to style it as if it is completed. So over here we can say wrapper.get. And then over here, of course, we're going to want to get the data test is equal to to-dos or to-do. And what we're going to say here is we're going to say dot class. So we're going to want to get its classes. This is actually going to return an array of all of the classes. So we're going to get all of the classes. And then over here, we're going to say dot contain. Dot to contain. And then we're going to say completed. So it's just going to see inside of this array, do we have the completed class or the string completed. So that's really the test. Very simple. And I'm not going to run it because I think you guys get the point. It is going to fail. So let's make it pass right now. And so to make it pass, well, over here, we're going to have to conditionally render a class. So we're going to have to conditionally render some sort of class. So let's actually go here, and this is going to be dependent on the to-do or the completed status of this to-do. And so we're going to say here that, hey, if to-do dot completed, if it is completed, then we want to render this completed class, else we just don't want to render anything. So that's what we want to do. So that's pretty much it. So that's very simple. Now what we need here, inside here as well, we also need another input element that is a checkbox. So here we can say input, and then we can say type is equal to checkbox. And we can say that the V model is the actual to-do dot completed. All right, and then lastly, we're gonna give this a data test of to-do checkbox, and that's it. That's honestly it. Very, very simple to test this out. Well, it's not gonna work. Well, we're not gonna see it work because of course we need to style this. So let's go inside here. Let's just copy these styles, and then in here we can say that the dot completed, we're gonna have a text transform. I honestly do not remember the style of this, and the lack of auto completion is not helping. So we're gonna say line through. I think that's a valid style. And so if I were to actually click on this, we're not getting the line through, which is a little bit confusing to me. Why are we not getting the line through? Let's get rid of that. There we go. Let's refresh. And we're still not getting the line through. Maybe the styles is wrong. Maybe if I give it something like color green. Let's refresh that. Okay, there we go. Okay. So it was just me being really confused. Let's go here, let's put these back. I think you guys can figure out what this is. I honestly don't remember. Let's say if we're done it, we're just gonna change the color to green. Okay. If you want to have a line through it, that's completely fine. But I don't remember the actual CSS styles. I thought that was it, but I guess not. All right, so that's pretty much it. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and test this. And that's really what we're doing here. We just want to test it. We want to test that this class is inside of this element. And it is. Terrific. So we have pretty much built out our application. And this is honestly, even though this is a very simple application, this is really how most testing is going to be. You're going to want to break most of your application into very small components. And ultimately, you're going to want to test those components in complete isolation. And therefore, the test should be relatively simple for each component because we're not having components interacting with one another. And this is known as unit testing, where you're testing each component in isolation. However, when you want to test components that interact with one another, and you want to test that, hey, once they interact with one another, do they work as expected? This is more complicated testing, and it's known as integration testing. And you can actually do this with Jest and Vue Test Utils by having a component, a very large component that has many children, and just testing how that component is interacting with all those children. So you can definitely do that, and that's known as integration testing. And if you want to even go one step further, you can do E2E testing. And a very popular framework, a JavaScript framework for that, is Cypress. So I highly recommend that. Now we're not done yet. There's still so much more to learn, and I'll see you guys in the next section. In this section, what we're going to be doing is looking at how we can reduce redundancy within our code. Now, at the moment, there's not really a lot of redundancy, but I can actually point to, well, this over here. So for each component, it seems like we're just mounting our to-do app and we're getting it as a wrapper. And again, it's okay. It's not that redundant, but we may in the future have a lot of redundant code. So how can we fix this? Well, this is something that is actually pre-built with Jest, and it is going to be the before each hook. And what this is going to do is it's going to it's a method that takes in a callback and is going to run whatever is inside that callback before each test. And what this is going to allow us to do is, well, reduce the redundancy of our code. Now, before each is not the only thing that exists in Jest. We also have before all. So this is going to run once before all of our tests. And we also have after all, and after each. And you can probably assume what these do. Now, we can definitely use these things to like clean things up, but well, I'm not going to do that. So how could we reduce the redundancy of our code using the before each hook? Well, what we can do is we can just go ahead and just wrap this in here. Now, the only issue is this right here is not going to have access to this right now because this const wrapper is inside of this before each hook. So what we could do to fix that, so we can give our test access to the wrapper, is we could say let wrapper over here in the very top, and then in the before each hook, we can just say wrapper is equal to mount wrapper. And that way, what we can do is we can have access to each wrapper, and this will significantly reduce the redundancy in our test. So this is a very, very simple thing that we can do, and just to prove to you that it works, let's just get rid of that. We should still have 5 tests passing. And we do. So yeah, so this is something that you can definitely utilize to reduce the redundancy in your tests. In this section, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about different ways that we can find elements. Now, in our to-do component, we found that we can find a lot of elements with, well, the get method. However, sometimes using the get method doesn't really work for our purposes, and I'm going to explain why. The get method assumes that we have that element inside of our document. And if we don't have it, it's going to throw an error and it's going to cause our tests to fail. And sometimes this is exactly what we want. If we can't find an element, yes, the test should probably fail. However, sometimes what we want to do is we conditionally render components or elements, and we want to test that, hey, if this condition is met, this element should not be present. And by using get, well, we're never really able to do that because when we don't find the element, it throws an error. So we can't assert that that element is not there because, well, it's just going to go ahead and fail. And so there's actually better ways of handling this rather than using get when you want to assert something like this. So to assert something like this, let's actually just create another nav.view. And in here, let's just copy everything we have in here. And very simply, what we're going to do is we're going to build a very, very, very simple nav bar. So let's just use the nav HTML semantic elements here. And we're going to have anchor tags. So we're going to have very, very simple anchor tags. And we're going to have 2 anchor tags. So over here, we're going to say home. And over here, we're going to say my profile. Now, we only want to render my profile when or if we are logged in. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go here and we're going to have data. So we're going to have data, and then what we're going to do is we're going to return, and we are going to return a Boolean value is logged in. And initially, we're going to just set this to false. So initially, we're not going to be logged in. And so over here, we're going to have our home. Remember, this is going to be rendered regardless if you're logged in or not. And over here, we're going to have my profile, and this is going to be conditionally rendered if this is true. So what we can do here is just say vif, we can say is logged in. So this is how we can conditionally render things in Vue. Let's actually just give this an ID of profile, and we can also give it an href, but it's not going anywhere, and I am very lazy. Over here, we could kind of do the same thing. Let's just give this an ID of home, and that's pretty much it. So now what we want to do is let's go to our app.vue file, and I actually already did this. So I imported the nav component. I have the component here, and I'm rendering it here. So now if I were to refresh, I see absolutely nothing for some reason. Why is that? I am very surprised, and that's because this nav is empty. Okay, what were we working on here? We were working on this? Yeah, we were working on this, which is a copy for some reason. I have no idea what's going on. Let's just get rid of this copy. I honestly have no idea how that got there. Okay, so let's save this, and we should see a nav. And you see here that we're conditionally rendering it. And if this were to be true, we should see the my profile. And these really don't do anything, but they're just for illustrative purposes. So what I want to do is, okay, if this is false, I want to test that I don't see this. So what you probably could do, or what you think you could do, is use the get method, get this element, assert that it's not there. But again, if we can't get the element, it's going to throw an error, so we can't even reach that assertion. So instead, what we're going to use is some other method known as find and .exists. So that is what we're going to be utilizing. So in here, let's just create a nav.spec.js. And let's just follow the template over here. I'm just going to copy this, paste that in there, and we're going to say nav, and we're going to say nav, we're going to say nav here, and I think that's pretty much it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to get rid of all this. We're going to say nav here. And so terrific. So now what we want to do is, of course, we want to assert. Let's actually assert in the beginning that if it is true, we render the my profile text. So we should say here, renders a profile link. Now, initially, this is going to be false. So what we can do is we can supply it with data. And over here, we can just return. And over here, we can return that I forget what it was called, is logged in is true. So here we can initially set the state to true. And now what we can do is, well, we can actually, because here we're asserting that it actually exists, and if it doesn't exist, we probably want to throw an error. Let's actually use get for this. And this kind of makes sense to use get for. So let's say const, and we're going to say profile link, and then over here wrapper, and then dot, and then we can say hashtag profile. So this is how usually we have been getting things by test ID, but we can also get things by ID if we want to, by symbolizing hashtag. We can also get things by element. We can also get things by class. So now what we want to do is, well, we got the element, and now what we can basically do here is we can say something like profile.text, and we can say, you know, we expect this to equal or to be, honestly, same thing. And we can say that we expect this to be my profile. So let's save that. And let's just double check over here, my profile. Might as well also change this to nav in the meanwhile. And so let's actually go ahead and let's give this a go. Let's run this test. And it should pass, and it does. Terrific. All right, so this is really cool. And what's great about this is right here, if we can't find that particular element, it's not even going to reach the expect statement. It's going to fail right over here because that's the default behavior of get. It's going to throw an error. And now in this case, it's completely fine because we're testing if that element exists. But now what if we're testing if it doesn't exist? So we're going to say here, it should not render a profile link. So this is what we are testing here. All right, let's just give you guys more space here. So in this case, we're gonna have our wrapper, and our wrapper is gonna be false this time. So we're gonna have false here. And so we shouldn't expect this over here. And just to prove to you that this is going to trigger an error, so I'm going to have this here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say expect true dot to be truthy, And what this does is it just asserts that true is a truthy value. And just to 100% prove to you that this is going to pass, let's go ahead here and we're going to comment this line out, and we're going to go ahead and just run this test, and we should have 7 passing tests. All right, so this assertion over here will always pass. Now let's go ahead and let's just try to find the element, and we're not going to find it because this is false. And you might think, okay, we don't find it, that's fine, but then we're going to assert that this is true. We should still have 7 passing tests, but that's not the case. Over here, the default behavior is that it's going to fail. So we should have 1 failing test, and 3, 2, 1, we do. We do, right there. And the error is, hey, we cannot find this element, again, because the get, by default, it throws an error if it doesn't exist. So instead, what we might want to do here, if we want to assert that something exists or it doesn't exist, is use find. So instead of doing this, what we can do here is we can say wrapper, and then we can say find, and then over here we can say hashtag profile, and then in here we can use exists. And so over here we're saying wrapper.find, and we can of course extract this out over here saying const profile link is equal to this, and then we can say here that the profile link exists, and then what this is going to do is going to return either a true or false value. So we can actually leave this, but now we can over here say that this is false. So we assert that this is not going to exist, and now over here, if we were to run this again, it is going to pass. So that's just a nuance that you need to understand. If you're asserting for something that doesn't exist, you want to use find and you want to use the .exists over get. In this very last section, as I promised, I'm going to explain the concept of shallow rendering. And let's actually do this through an example. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create 2 components. One of them is going to be a child and one of them is going to be a parent. So over here, we're going to say parent.view. And then over here, we're going to say child.view. So we're going to have 2 components, 1 parent and then 1 child. And in here, of course, we need our typical Vue application. So as usual, let's just go into our message.view. And for both, let's just go ahead and let's add that in there. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to get rid of this. We're going to change this to parent or child rather. And then over here, we're going to get rid of this. And over here, we're going to get rid of this. We're going to change this to parent. And over here, we're going to get rid of this over here. Okay, cool. So now what I want to do is I want to import this child into the parent and render this child in here. So let's just say that this is a child. Save that. This is a parent. And let's save that. And so now, okay, let's go ahead and let's import. And we want to import child and then from /child.view. And so this is a component that we want to ultimately render. So what we can do here is we can say components. And we can say that, well, a component that we want is child. And over here, right under the parent, let's just also render, or you know what? Yeah, right under the parent, we're going to render the child as well. So right here. And just to double check that this works, let's just render this component inside of our app.view or app component right here. So we're going to say parent, and then over here we're going to have to do some import parent from /components/parent.view. Let's just render it down here for now. Save that. And of course, we're getting some errors, unfortunately. Super apologies. So we have our components, we have our parent. Yes, I get it. There we go. Okay, cool. So we have a parent and then we have this child over here. So this is really just one component, but it's comprised of a nested child. So what if we wanted to test out this parent component? So we want to test out this component over here. And we want to test out that the text parent is present inside of this parent component. So this is actually a very, very easy test that we have done so far. So what we can go here is we can say parent, if I can type, .spec.js. And as usual, I am going to be very lazy, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy all this. I'm going to paste that in there. And I'm going to say parent. And over here, I'm going to say parent. And I'm going to be extremely lazy. And I'm not even going to give this test, actually, I'm not even going to give this test a name. I'm just going to leave it as is. Okay, so over here, what we want to do is we want to render the parent component. And right now, let's just get rid of the props because there is no props. So what we want to do is we want to get this wrapper, and then we want to find all of the text inside of the parent. And I want to test that, well, the parent exists. So the text parent exists. And it should. Let's just get rid of all these other things. And it should because, well, it does exist. We added it right here. So let's give this a test, and this should result in an extra additional test that passes. So we should have 8 in total. And we do. Now, one thing I want to note is, okay, so this is awesome. This is really cool. Now let's actually go ahead and let's change this to child. So to child. Let's save that. And remember, in this parent component, the text child isn't present there in the root level component. What we're doing is we have this other component here, this child component. And in here, that text is present, child. So what do you think is going to happen here? Let's go ahead and let's run this. And it is going to pass. And so by default, when using mount, what happens is it mounts the parent component as well as any children component. And that is really, really great for integration tests as well. We can get all of the components that is inside of a parent and just see how they interact with one another and if they result in the exact outcome that we want. However, sometimes, in some cases, we really just want to test out our application in complete isolation, our component in complete isolation. And maybe a good example of this is maybe this is, child, this says something like child with parents. Child with parents. And if this is the case, and I were to somehow accidentally get rid of this, and if I were to run this test, it's still going to pass even though the intended effect wasn't, like this wasn't the intended effect. I wanted to see if the parent text was in the parent component. So in this case, what we want to do instead is use shallow mount. And what this does is it forgets about all of the other components within the parent component and just focuses on that one component. And that is what is meant by shallow mount. So over here, we're going to say shallow mount. And now if I were to run this, it is going to pass because we have parent here. Actually, it failed. So expected substring child, but it received parent. Sorry, what was the test doing again? Oh, sorry, it should be parent here. So we should have parent here. And it's going to pass in this case. Okay, cool. However, now, if I were to remove this, even though this passed before, because remember, in the child, we have parent in here, what's going to happen is it's going to fail because we have shallow rendered it. And you can see here that it works as expected. So that's a time where you want to use shallow rendering. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next one.